So now that we've gone through the configuring the access policy for the explicit mode, as we said initially, there is no real difference from the WSA perspective if the request is received in transparent mode or in for the explicit mode. From the access policy point of view, which governs the final decision of the WSA for that session, there is no real difference on how the session was received inbound. So we're going to go now to the transparent functionality, meaning we're going to take the client's request and use a network device, which is going to be a switch, an ASA firewall, or a router, and redirect the traffic to the WSA. For that, we're going to make use of WCCP, which stands for Web Cache Communication Protocol, to do the integration between the networking devices and the WSA. Now, if we look here at the slides, basically there are two versions of WCCP, which first was version 1 and then is version 2. For the lab, we're concerned with version 2 because version 2 supports more than just the HTTP protocol. So what I mean by that is that version 1 supported redirection from the network device to the WSA only for HTTP traffic. For the scope of the lab, we want both HTTP and HTTPS traffic to be redirected. So we're going to make use of WCCP version 2. What we also need to understand is what exactly does mean the WCCP client and the WCCP server. Now, this has nothing to do with the actual traffic flow. And what I mean by that is that, for example, let's look at the diagram, and let's say that I'm going to do the redirection. Let's say I'm going to use switch 1, which is this one, to do the redirection to WSA. So let's say that test PCA will initiate some traffic to some HTTP session to test server B. And when the session reaches switch 1 will take that traffic and redirect it to the WSA, which is this case. And then the WSA will generate the session to the server B. So again, this was session 1, and this is session 2. So now, from the WCCP perspective, the client is actually the WSA. So it has nothing to do with who does the redirection. You would think that the client is the switch in this case because the switch performs the redirection. Actually, it's the other way around. So basically, the WCCP client is the WSA. So the WCCP client is this one, the WSA. And the WCCP server is the switch. And now, to better understand why this is the case, is that when you configure both the switch and the WSA for WCCP integration, the session and the negotiation for WCCP is initiated by the WSA. So because basically WCCP, it's a client server type of session. Who initiates the session will be the client, and who responds to the session will be the server. So that's why, because the WSA actually initiates the session, then that's why the WSA is actually the client. So looking back at the slides now, the functional modes, what you can do, how can you implement WCCP in the network? You have two options. You have the layer 2 options, and you have the GRE option. Layer 2 would mean that the network device performing the redirection and the WSA need to be in the same VLAN, same subnet. While the GRE option is for the case when the network device that performs the redirection and WSA are not sharing the same VLAN or same subnet. So for example, if I'm going to take a look back at the diagram, so let's open back the diagram, which is this one. Let's say again that I choose ASA to perform the redirection, which is ASA 3. And let's say that again the client is test PCA in here, so this is my client. And let's say that test PCA initiates a session to R6. So I will perform an HTTP request to R6. If I choose that when the session reaches ASA 3, this is the client session, I want to configure the ASA 3 to perform the redirection to the WSA. So this would be again session 1. In this case, because the ASA is not sharing the same subnet as the WSA, so basically ASA is in VLAN 93 and the WSA is in VLAN 28, then I cannot use the layer 2 method. I need to use the GRE functionality of WCCP to make the ASA redirect the session to the WSA. Looking back at the slides now, it really depends on the network device performing the redirection. It may support both modes or just one mode. So basically, the switches from the lab support only the layer 2 functionality. There are other layer 3 switches like the Catalyst 6K, which also supports GRE method, but that's not in the scope of the lab. So for the scope of the lab, where we have only 3560s or 3750X switches, those support only layer 2 functionality. And additionally, we'll see exactly what the redirection method means, because we can do inbound redirection or outbound redirection. There's also another restriction which you're going to see live on the switch, that you need to change the SDM template of the switch to make WCCP work when you do the integration. Routers support both layer 2 and GRE, so you can choose either one. And ASA supports only the GRE method. ASA has also another restriction. It's actually a design restriction, meaning that the clients initiating the HTTP session and the WSA need to be on the same side of the SA. So again, the clients and the WSA need to be on the same side of the firewall. What I mean by that, let's go and look at the diagram back again. So let's open up the diagram again, which is this one. Give me a moment here. So let's open back the diagram again. And so for example, in my case, if I choose to use ASA3 to redirect the traffic, in my case, ASA3, let's say that this is the client. So this is my client, SPCA. And this is the server. So basically, SPCA initiates a session to R6. And in my case, if I perform the redirection from ASA3, both the clients and the WSA are facing the same interface of the ASA, which is gig 1093. So in this case, the integration between ASA and WSA will work. But for example, if I had WSA connected on, let's say, another interface here, which was called DMZ, and I had my WSA here attached, which was WSA. So if this was the case, and because the client was reachable over the, let's say, inside interface, which was gig 0193, and the WSA was reachable over the DMZ interface, in this case, the WCC integration between the ASA and WSA will not work. And this is a design restriction only with ASA, and it's based on how transparent transparent mode works, and based on the fact that ASA is a stateful firewall. So this is one thing you need to be aware of. Now, let's go ahead and we're going to choose the switch. So looking back at the diagram in here, I'm going to choose switch 1 to perform the redirection between the client, between the network and the WSA. So let's go on switch 1. And first, what I want to do, I want to configure what's the traffic that I want to redirect. So basically what I want to say is when the switch receives what kind of traffic is the one that I want to send it to the WSA, which in my case is HTTP and HTTPS. For the moment, I'm going to work only with the HTTP traffic. So what I want to do is I'm going to create an access list. Let's call it API access list client traffic. And I'm going to say extended. So let's say extended in here. So IP access extended client traffic. And I'm going to say permit TCP. The subnet would be 136.1.37.0. And I'm going to allow this traffic to any equal port 80. So only HTTP traffic. Exit. And now what I want to do is I want to say IP WCCP. And now I'm going to create a service number, which should match when I configure the WSA as well. I'm going to say 91. and then I'm going to say redirect list, which would be my configure list, which is client traffic. So this one. So client traffic, I said question mark, I can optionally configure a password. The password needs to be between 1 and 7 characters. I'm going to say Cisco, which is 5. And I can also optionally say a group list. So now the group list functionality is optional. You don't have necessarily to configure it. What the group list option does, it restricts which WCCP clients, basically which WSA, can actually register to the switch. So by using the group list, I restrict what WSAs can actually register to the switch through WCCP, and this is optional. What is mandatory is to define the WCCP service ID and specify which traffic will get redirected from the switch to the WSA. So let's say that I say password Cisco. Let's say I'm going to say IP access list, what would be this server WSA. This is going to be standard, for example. And I'm going to say permit host 172.16.6.100. And I'm going to attach this access list as the group list to my rule. So I'm going to say group list server underscore WSA. As I said, this is optional. And so basically, I just configured the redirect list, the group list. I've configured the WCCP service ID, which needs to match, as we're going to see, on the WSA. Now I want to enable the redirection. The switch supports only inbound redirection. So if I look back on my diagram, diagram in here, which would be this one. If my client would be TestPCA, it means that basically the HTTP session from the client will be received inbound by the switch on VLAN 37. So I need to apply WCCP integration inbound on VLAN 37 because the switch supports only inbound redirection. So I'm going to on the switch, I'm going to say show run interface VLAN 37, nothing applied. So I'm going to say interface VLAN 37, and I'm going to say IP WCCP, then the service number, which is 91, and I'm going to say redirect inbound, and that's it. Now, based on the switch model you're running, you may receive an error message, which is this one in here, saying WCCP requires SDM template routing. So based on the switch code you're running, you may get this error message or not. What this means is that WCCP is not supported with the SDM template. What does the SDM template do is it basically assigns resources of the switch to certain functionalities. So if we do show SDM template, show SDM prefer, then the default template, which is called desktop default, has basically like this amount of resources assigned to unicast MAC addresses and this amount of resources assigned to IPv4 hosts, and this amount of resources assigned to IPv4 routes. The problem with WCCP is that it shares the same resources as the policy routing, which being 0, it means that it has no resources of the switch available. So that's why I need to change the SDM template to something that it actually allocates some resources to this policy, which will basically allow WCCP to work. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to say conft, and I'm going to say SDM prefer, and I'm going to say routing. This requires the switch to reload, so I'm going to say write memory, and then I'm going to reload the switch. So I'm going to say reload. Meanwhile, we're going to move to the WSA to configure the integration. So I want to go to network transparent direction. Let me go ahead and authenticate again. Well, actually, what happened is that most probably I lost communication from TestPCA to the switch. So we need to wait for the switch to boot up again. Okay, so now that the switch rebooted, we're going to go ahead and see that the SDM template was actually changed successfully. So I'm going to go and say enabled and then Cisco, and let's say show SDM prefer. And now I should see that it has some resources assigned to the policy-based routing, which means also for WCCP, which it is. Now, because the WCCP client was not configured, when I'll do show IP WCCP summary, which should be this. So IP WCCP 91, which is my service ID. Then this not yet determined router identifier basically means that the WCCP client did not register with the WCCP server. This is because, of course, I didn't yet configure WSA. Once the WSA is configured and the configuration is correct, and it will register with the WCCP server, which is the switch, then I should see that the switch assigns itself a router identifier. So let's go and configure the WSA further. I'm going to go on test PC and I'm going to basically reconnect to my WSA. So HTTPS 172.16.6.100 on port 8443. And I'm going to go ahead and authenticate with the default username and password. And now I'm going to go to network, transparent direction, and I'm going to say edit device, and I'm going to choose WCCP. Now you can also say you're going to use a layer 4 switch, which that means you're going to use something like policy-based routing to take traffic from the network from the client and send it to the WSA. This is not in the scope of the lab. For the lab, you only need to know the WCCP integration. So we're going to go to WCCP version 2 router. Although it says version 2 router, you can actually do the integration, as I said, from both a switch, an ASA firewall, or a router. Version 2 means that I'm using WCCP version 2 to make the integration happen. So I'm going to say submit, and I'm going to say add service. And then I'm going to give it just a name. I'm going to say VLAN 37, let's say. So VLAN 37. And then the service ID needs to match what I configured on the switch. Because basically once I configure the WSA, which is the WCCP client, and it will initiate the registration with the switch, the authentication process is also based on the service ID number. The service ID number needs to match between the WCCP client and the WCCP server. So I'm going to use the same service ID number. I'm going to say that I'm using port 80 because I've configured the switch to redirect only port 80 traffic to the WSA. And then I'm going to configure the password, which was Cisco. So the WCCP authentication is optional. I just chose to do that, but it's not mandatory. I'm going to say Cisco. You want to be careful when you type in the password. It says in here that it needs to be between 1 and 7 characters. However, there are some bugs on the GUI which basically allow you to put like an 8-character or a 9-character password, but it will never work. But it actually allows you to type in that password, but it will of course never work. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to say advanced. And I can use the default allow GRU layer 2 for forwarding method and return method. Now what you want to be careful in the lab is that the way WSA works is that if you leave the defaults, which means allow GRU all layer 2, the WSA will try and register with the WCCP server using layer 2 method. If it fails, it actually does not fail back to GRE method. So in case you use the ASA to do integration, or use the router, but the router is not directly connected to the WSA, so you use basically the GRE method, what you want to do is want to go in here and say that you want to say allow GRE only. So again, unless you do this and you need the GRE method, basically the integration between the WSA and the network device will fail, because the WSA does not fail back to GRE if the layer 2 method is not functional. But for my case, I'm using the switch, which basically is saying allow GRE or layer 2 or allow layer 2 only should work anyways. So I'm going to say submit. Router IP address, I forgot to do, so this would be switch 1, which is, let's say, let's go on switch 1 and let's pick an IP address of switch 1. This would be, let's say, 150.199, or let's pick the one from VLAN 28, 172.16.61. So I'm going to say 172.16.61. This is the switch IP address, and say submit. And then let's say commit changes. Commit changes. Now what I want to do, I want to go on the switch, and I want to say again show IP WCCP 91, and I should see it's still not registered. So WSA still didn't register to the switch. We will give it a while to do that. Let's wait a bit. So let's see if the changes were committed. Let me go back on the switch and say again 91. It says total authentication failures. So basically at this point it seems that the authentication fails. Let me look on the config, show run include IPWCCP. And I'm using a password of Cisco on this side. Let me check that basically, let's say, let's click the service profile. So this is 91, which is the same as on the switch, is good. And let's say, let's go to the password functionality and let's configure it again. So I want to type in Cisco and then again Cisco. And say submit. Let's say commit changes. Commit changes. Let's go back on the switch and say show IP WCCP 91. So now it's successfully registered because I see that the switch selected a router identifier. So this is kind of a good method to verify that the WSA correctly registered with the switch or the network device in general. And I also got a log message saying that basically the integration is now functional. As I said initially, from the policy point of view, it really doesn't matter how the session is received from the WSA. If it's through WCCP or it's from explicit forward mode, the same access policies can be applied to the user session. So what this means is that at this point, if I go initiate a session from the TSPCA in transparent mode, then the traffic should be redirected to WSA based on my configured policies. So if I go and look at on my diagram back here, so I'm going to send traffic from TSPCA to, let's say, to what? Let's say to R4. So I'm going to initiate an HTTP session to R4 because I have inbound on VLAN 36, the WCCP integration performed. Then that session will get redirected by the switch to the WSA, and based on the configured policies, it should be allowed. So let's go to the WSA, and I need to watch the live logs. I'm gonna log in, default 1A, and I'm gonna say tail, and let's say 1 access logs. Let me go now to the client, which is this one. And let me initiate an HTTP session to switch to R4, for example. HTTP 150.1.4.4. It says I cannot go there based on the uncategorized URL functionality, because basically if I go back, on the configuration in here, I'm accessing a web resource based on IP address, not based on the URL name, which basically fails back on the unknown URL category settings. So let's go there and change that to the default, which was monitor. So I'm going to here and say monitor, and they submit. I should also see that in the logs actually, which I do. So I see this in the logs that the session was initiated to 151.44, and it was allowed. It says block webcat. It was allowed based on the uncategorized functionality which I had configured. Let's say commit changes, and commit changes. And then let's go back on the logs, and let's go back on the client and initiate the session again. So let's go here and say, now I get prompted with the username and password, which means the session was allowed. If I look on the logs, I should pretty soon see a log message. So this is the previous one where the session was basically blocked. I should see soon a new log message saying that the session was basically allowed, which it is. So I'm matching, the client is test PC, which is 136.137.51. I'm accessing the HTTP server of R4. This was my request, which matched the identity policy of VLAN 37 and the access policy of VLAN 37, which is good. And this was allowed. So basically, as I said, it doesn't matter how the session is received by the WSA, the same identity policies and the same access policies can be applied. What I can also do for transparent mode is I can configure a proxy bypass list. So proxy bypass list would mean that if I access the URL, like let's say google.com, and that's configured as a bypass list on the WSA side, it means that the WSA will inject the session back into the network without proxying it. The proxy bypass list works only for transparent mode because basically in explicit for mode, the bypass list is configured on the client side. Because at that moment, the client directly speaks with the WSA, so whatever request is sent to the WSA, those cannot be bypassed. So if I look on the client side, and let's say I go to the browser settings, which is internet options, and then connections, and then LAN settings. Let's say I want to use the proxy of WSA. I can say bypass proxy server for local addresses, and going to advanced, I can also say do not use proxy server for addresses belonging with. So basically, for the explicit mode, if I want my client to directly send traffic to some URLs like google.com, I will add that URL in here, and the proxy bypass list is basically locally configured on the client. But for transparent mode, because the client is not aware of the WSA being in a network, I need to configure the proxy bypass list on the WSA. So let's go and configure, let's go on the WSA, and let's say I want to do the following policy, which says, so I go to Web Security Manager, and then to, that was in Security Services actually. I should be here, it's bypass settings. And then I go to proxy bypass, and I say edit proxy bypass settings. And I want to say that session is going to Google, so www.google.com will be bypassed. And I say submit. And I say commit changes. Commit changes. So now I go on the WSA, and I say, I exit from here, and I say tail. And I want to look at the proxy bypass list logs, which should be in here. Let me check bypass logs. So number 4. So basically, if at this moment, if the configuration is functional, when I'll initiate a session from the client to google.com, which resolves again to R4's loopback IP address, and that will be redirected by the switch to the WSA. Based on the configured policy, that should be reinjected back in the network by the WSA without proxying it. And I should see that in the logs here. So let's go on the client, and I want to say, let's go on the client. Let's see first if NSLOOKUP works. So if DNS resolution works, so let's say NSLOOKUP, and the DNS server is this one. Let me configure the client with the DNS server of R4. So I want to say change settings in here and right-click properties. And then I say that I'm using the DNS server of 150.1.4.4. OK. OK, close. And let's go and do the DNS lookup again. So NSLOOKUP. And I want to say www.google.com. So it's good, it resolves to the IP address of R4. Now let's go in here and say HTTP www.google.com. So I get presented with the HTTP authentication from R4, which if I go on R4, let's see if I have a username-based password configured, show run include HTTP. If not, I should be able to authenticate with the enabled password if I want to. So if I say Cisco, I should get access, which I do. So I see I'm connected to the web server of R4. And now if I look on the proxy logs, I see that the connection from the client, which was testpca, was bypassed. So what this means is that the session which was initiated by the client was not proxied by the WSA. It was injected back in the network. I can actually check that on R4 to see that R4 got a connection from actually the client itself, not from the WSA, which means that the WSA did not proxy the session. So I can go on R4 and I can say R4. I can say show IP HTTP. I think it's history. No, it's show IP HTTP server history. So the last session, as you can see, the last sessions came from the client. So as you see, the first sessions, all the previous session came from the IP address of the WSA, which is 172.16.6.100. So that confirms that all the sessions so far from the client to the server of R4 were actually proxied. So because the source IP address is the WSA, only the latest sessions, which were matching the proxy bypass list, I see that the source IP address of the session, of the HTTP session, is actually testpca, which is the client. Which basically this confirms that, again, the session was not proxied by the WSA, which actually injected the traffic back into the network.